Every year the world comes together to solve climate change, and as you might have noticed if you've looked out your window lately, the world has not solved climate change. So what's wrong with what we're doing? Can we fix how we fix climate change? Or is it time to cop out of COPs? I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And burning fossil fuels is changing the climate a lot. The last 2 years haven't just broken records, they've shattered records. With these soaring temperatures, we're seeing devastation in the form of deadly extreme weather and destruction to both the human and natural worlds. And now, global temperatures are perilously close to passing the 1.5 degree limit. We've set ourselves this limit to keep the most vulnerable people and ecosystems safe. But, I hear you cry, but all these headlines say we've already passed 1.5 degrees. Well, here's where the confusion comes from. The limit is generally understood to refer to the average temperature over many years passing 1.5 degrees, not just a single freakishly hot year like the one we've just had. So that would mean we haven't passed it yet, but we are painfully close. Actually, I'm planning to talk about what's going on with recent temperatures in a whole video coming up soon, so make sure you're subscribed for that. And while you're clicking on things, you should probably ring the bell and hit like too. Okay, but back to temperatures. Don't we have like a whole Paris climate agreement to stop this heating? We do, and that agreement is to limit temperature rise well under 2 degrees with the aim of keeping it under 1.5 degrees. Well, that sounds pretty good. The problem is that achieving either of those things would mean global emissions would need to drop fast. Well, we're 9 years on from the Paris Climate Agreement, and emissions are higher than they've ever been. And to understand why, you really need to understand why the Paris Climate Agreement is so weak. So why is the Paris Climate Agreement so weak? Well, I'm glad that you finally asked. The Paris Climate Agreement effectively lets countries commit to any kind of climate action they want. And let me guess, all the countries are incredibly ambitious and have put in place completely sufficient plans. Actually, would you believe, it's the complete opposite. Well, I never. This map from Climate Action Tracker shows how countries are doing on their climate action, with green meaning on track for limiting heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, you may say, but I can't see any countries colored green. To which I would say, exactly, I see. By the way, the countries with almost sufficient climate action are shaded in orange. Okay, but why are countries doing so insufficiently? Well, not only can countries set their own targets, but there are zero consequences for failing to set a strong enough target, or even failing to meet your target, other than, bad vibes from the international community. In theory, the way Paris should work is that countries get together every year and gradually get more and more serious climate action underway, which takes us neatly to COPs. Ah yeah, COPs, the big climate negotiations that happen every year. Yep, COP stands for Conference of the Parties, which, as I've said before and will doubtless say again, is just the least helpful and descriptive acronym ever, especially since there's the climate COPs and the biodiversity COPs. Anyway, it's not just their names that suck. The negotiations themselves have also always sucked, to some extent at least. We've just had the 29th negotiation, COP29, and guess what? We've still not solved climate change. I think it's fair to say that most people working on climate see these negotiations as necessary evils, frustrating and slow, but still making important progress. But the most recent COPs, the last two especially, have gone pretty light on the necessary and pretty heavy on the evil. This has a lot to do with where these negotiations have been held. Last year's was in the UAE, and this year's was in Azerbaijan. Ugh, right, big fossil fuel producers. And for some inexplicable reason, hosting the talks about how to stop the problem caused by fossil fuels in countries which are all about producing fossil fuels fuels hasn't gone great. Literally no one could have predicted that. The negotiations have been filled with fossil fuel lobbyists. Both times, the countries have used the world getting together as a way to make fossil fuel deals. And side note, but unlike a climate negotiation, I'm not trying to sneakily sell you stuff on the side. So I don't do product placement or monetization. And if you're into that, you can help me keep doing it by becoming a patron up here. But yeah, the last two climate negotiations have loved the thing that causes climate change. I mean, this year the host even described fossil fuels as a gift from God, which would be funny if these conferences weren't literally meant to be all about keeping this planet, our literal home, livable. COPs have now gotten so bad that some of the most important voices in climate have frankly had enough. Let's start with Greta Thunberg. Greta didn't attend this year's negotiations. Instead, she highlighted the hypocrisy of hosting the climate negotiations in an oil-producing country with records of profound human rights abuses. COP meetings have proven to be greenwashing conferences that legitimize countries' failures to ensure a livable world and future. I was thinking about trying to do a Greta impression there, but when I practiced it, it was too cringe even for me. Okay, but Greta has been incredibly critical of these negotiations since she first went in 2018.
You say you love your children above all else, and yet you're stealing their future in front of their very eyes.
So it's hardly surprising that she's done. Sure, but she's not the only one. A group of experts recently penned a letter to the United Nations arguing that the negotiations are no longer fit for purpose. And these aren't just randoms like, I don't know, climate YouTubers. The signatories included the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the former UN climate chief Christiana Figueres, who literally oversaw the formation of the Paris Climate Agreement. They wrote that COP's current structure simply cannot deliver the change at exponential speed and scale, which is essential to ensure a safe climate landing for humanity. So, pretty brutal words from people who know the climate negotiations better than anyone. Okay, but these critiques are all about the process of COPs. If they still get results, then I mean, okay, they're not getting results, are they? I mean, they are still getting results, but in kind of the same way that my E in my Italian exam when I was 13 was also getting a result. Molto deludente. At COP29 this year, the big news was richer nations promising lower income nations $300 billion per year in climate finance. I mean, that sounds like a pretty big step, right? But peer behind the headlines and it is way short of what's needed and is actually mobilized funds, which means it can come in the form of loans, which can strap lower income nations with huge interest to pay back. This is just one part of how the latest talks expose deep divides between higher and lower income nations. In fact, the leaders of the world's 13 biggest polluters didn't even show up to the talks. And of course, on top of all this are the US and Argentina threatening to leave the Paris Climate Agreement, weakening the whole every country working together thing that the negotiations are meant to be all about. Okay, so a rough year. But you said COP28 was also rubbish. But I remember loads of good news coming out of the negotiations last year. But a lot of that has proven to be pretty flimsy. One of the core achievements was countries coming together to triple renewables by 2030. Well, we're way off track on that one. Then there was the $30 billion fund from the UAE, money that was meant to speed up the energy transition and build climate resilience, especially in the global south. Well, it backed a fund that agreed to buy a major fossil gas pipeline in North America. That doesn't sound like it's helping the energy transition or building climate resilience. And North America definitely doesn't sound like it's in the global south. One of the biggest deals at COP28 was countries agreeing to a text that said the world needs to transition away from fossil fuels. But why would that be a big deal? That's just what needs to happen to stop the thing that countries say they're trying trying to stop? Fantastic question, which I have no idea how to answer. But the truth is that this was a major win, since these negotiations generally shy away from mentioning the thing causing the problem that they're trying to solve. But COP29 failed to take this pledge forward, leaving that decision till next year. So yeah, overall COP28 also kinda sucked. And I don't want to be all like, I told you so in advance, but I mean, I do kinda wanna say it. Okay, so I'm beginning to get the impression that you're not the biggest fan of COPs. What could have possibly given me away? Yeah, well, I'm something of an empath. The point isn't about whether or not I like the negotiations, even though you're right, I don't. The point is whether the negotiations are useful or not, and by many measures, they still are. Thanks to these negotiations, we have the Paris Climate Agreement, where almost every country in the world is signed up to limit heating. Thanks to these negotiations, there's meaningful progress in working together to lower emissions and to adapt to the changes that we can't prevent. Thanks to these negotiations, the nations that have done the most to cause the problem are doing something to support the nations that are already feeling the worst consequences. Okay, wait. First you talk about all the ways in which COPs are rubbish, especially the most recent ones, and now you're talking about how good they are? I don't remember using the word good. The thing is, though, that two things are true at the same time. COPs have achieved a huge amount of important stuff, and what COPs have achieved and the speed they've achieved it at is nowhere near enough to tackle the problem. Okay, so where do we go from here? Do we stick with COPs because they're getting some stuff done? Or do we scrap them because they're getting so much less done than we need? The thing is, I've heard different people arguing for both keeping and abandoning COPs since I started working on climate change over a decade ago. Okay, so what about all those experts who wrote that letter about how COPs are rubbish? Are they saying we should cancel COPs? Well, no. They're talking much more about changing these negotiations so they do a better job. That means only having these negotiations in countries that actually want to fight climate change, having more meetings that focus more on putting solutions into place, and being more careful about that whole swarms of fossil fuel company lobbyists thing, which is quite a wish list. Right, and as for Greta Thunberg, while she's explicitly called out the negotiations, especially the most recent ones, she's not, to my knowledge, said they should be scrapped. Instead, she's argued that, for her, they're better places to spend her energy, that she wants to focus on grassroots activism and support those who are trying to make a difference. But what do climate negotiations mean to the people who are actually at the greatest risk of climate change? Take the inhabitants of what we call low-lying island nations. Nations that are made up of islands that are low. Ah, so you've heard of them? No, I just have very good intuition. Well, these countries are at huge risk of effectively being wiped out by sea level rise. And while their negotiators have long called out the flaws in COPs, they point out that scrapping them could be even worse. The thing is that at COPs, all countries are present and take part in the process. If instead the focus was on, for example, discussions between rich nations at G20 forums, smaller, more vulnerable nations might find themselves without a voice. Okay, so you're saying we shouldn't cop out of COPs? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm just a physicist. Politics is incredibly confusing to me. I mean, look, these negotiations are rubbish. And they are useful. One thing I've learned from climate science, though, is that we need every solution we can get to tackle climate change. But we also can't rely on any single solution to single-handedly save the day. And I reckon that probably applies just as well to negotiations as it does to wind turbines. And look, one area where we desperately need every single solution we can get is coral reefs. And not just because they're beautiful, but also because they're vitally important for us. And here's why. Okay, until next time, bye. Seriously, please click this video. It is incredibly important, and frankly, not enough of you have watched it yet. Limit that we've set. I just inhaled my hair.